Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the times the Middle Ages almost wiped humanity out, not from dragons or comets, but from a long list of terrible ideas that everyone thought were brilliant at the time. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this, a quick like helps a lot, and if you actually like what I do here, consider subscribing. No pressure, but it does mean the algorithm stops yelling at me. Drop a comment too. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? I love seeing who's up late with me around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe open a window or turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. If medieval medicine had a Yelp page, the reviews would be short and mostly written by relatives. Their whole system was built on a simple idea. If the body's acting up, drain some liquid until it either calms down or stops moving. That was bloodletting, the medieval version of had you tried turning it on and off again, except the off switch was a knife. Doctors believed everything came down to 4 humors. If you were sick, one of them was out of line. Which one? Honestly, they didn't always know, but the fix was always the same: open a vein. Fever? Bleed him. Infection? Bleed him. Cough? Bleed him. Just feeling a bit off today? Might as well bleed him. Can't hurt. Their logic was almost poetic. Sick people are weak, so they must be overloaded with blood. Remove it, fast. The weaker you got, the more convinced the treatment was working. And the process wasn't subtle. Knives, lancets, leeches, nature's tiny vampires silently judging your life choices while sucking you dry. Patients were often bled until they passed out, which doctors took as a good sign. Fainting meant the bad humors were leaving. Death? That was just the treatment finishing early. Bloodletting wasn't some fringe practice, it was standard care. Refusing it didn't make you cautious, it made you difficult. In medieval terms, that meant if you died, it was your own fault for not cooperating. Doctors who didn't bleed their patients were treated like quacks. How could someone get better if they still had all their blood? That just didn't make sense. During plagues and epidemics, this turned from reckless to catastrophic. People already weak from hunger, cold, and infection were stripped of the very thing keeping their organs alive. Immune systems collapsed, recovery became a myth, and when patients got worse, the solution wasn't to stop, it was to bleed them more. If the treatment wasn't working, clearly they just hadn't lost enough blood yet. From today's view, this looks like a slow-motion massacre. From their view, it was careful, responsible medicine, and that's what's so chilling. Humanity didn't just suffer through disease, it invited it in, handed it a scalpel, and said, "Take your time, we're in no rush." Somehow, enough people survived long enough to finally stop doing this. But just as medicine finished bleeding people into the afterlife, medieval diet advice stepped in to finish the job. Because when you're already starving, freezing, and sick, the logical next step is to avoid the few foods that might actually keep you alive. During famines and outbreaks, authorities told people to avoid fruits and vegetables, not because they were rotten, but because they were too moist. According to medical theory, moist foods messed up the humors, so apples were suspicious, greens were dangerous. Fresh food in general was treated like a health crime. Instead, people were told to eat heavy, dry stuff: meat, stale bread, thick porridge, and wine. Great advice for a noble with a full cellar. For everyone else, it was basically a starvation plan dressed up as wisdom. The problem, during a famine, meat was rare, bread was rationed, and wine was expensive. Fruits and vegetables were often the only things people could actually find. But eating them felt like tempting fate, so most people made the responsible choice: they just didn't eat. And when they did eat, it backfired. Heavy, dry food took energy to digest, energy that sick, starving bodies didn't have. People got weaker, Their immune systems quietly gave up and walked away. Doctors saw people getting worse and drew a very logical conclusion: the diet wasn't strict enough. Some even told patients to eat almost nothing when sick, because digestion distracted the body from healing. So during outbreaks, people responded by eating less, sometimes nothing at all. Children suffered the most. Growing bodies without proper nutrition stopped growing, then stopped fighting infection, then stopped altogether. Entire generations were thinned not by famine alone, but by the rules on how to survive it. And to make it worse, hunger was often seen as spiritually useful. If you were starving, God was testing you. If you died, the test was over. From today's view, this is horrifying. From their view, it was discipline, obedience, and faith. Humanity didn't just face food shortages, it added rules, fear, and guilt to them, and nearly starved itself out of existence, politely, obediently, and with terrifying consistency. Medieval people were capable of incredible things: farming without machines, building cathedrals without calculators, surviving winters that wanted them dead. What they didn't have was any real idea that dirty water could kill you, and that simple blind spot nearly erased whole cities. In medieval towns, waste management ran on one simple rule: once it's out the door, it's someone else's problem. Human waste, animal dung, rotting food, and anything unpleasant went into the street, into open pits, or straight into the nearest river. Rivers, in their view, had magical cleaning powers. If something went in upstream, it was gone by the time it reached you. Science. Unfortunately, rivers didn't get the memo. Cities often built latrines right over rivers. Whole neighborhoods flushed their waste into the same water they later used for drinking, washing, and brewing beer. The result: one sick person upstream and everyone downstream was unknowingly enrolled in a citywide biology experiment. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases spread like wildfire. Cities became self-sustaining disease factories, cheerfully recycling their own filth. And when outbreaks hit, nobody blamed the water. Why would they? It looked clear, it tasted fine, it wasn't screaming, "I'm poison." Instead, they blamed bad air, sin, foreigners, or the moon acting weird again. People burned incense, rang church bells, or fled the city, often carrying the disease with them. The water stayed untouched, unquestioned, and thoroughly contaminated. Even attempts to clean up made things worse. Washing clothes in rivers added more waste. Slaughterhouses dumped straight into streams. Tanners soaked hides in water that later flowed into wells. It was a perfect ecosystem of bad decisions, all working together. The craziest part: people knew something was wrong. They noticed patterns. Whole neighborhoods got sick after drinking from certain sources. But without germ theory, the conclusion wasn't "stop drinking that water." It was "something invisible is angry." From today's view, medieval sanitation looks like a horror story. From their view, it was normal, traditional, and just very, very unlucky. Humanity didn't just poison itself, it did it efficiently, systematically, and every single day, one innocent sip at a time. When plague hit medieval Europe, people didn't just want answers, they needed someone to blame. Unfortunately, instead of finding germs, they found vibes, and the vibes were terrible. Something had to be responsible, and medieval society decided that something was cats. Cats had a serious image problem. They were quiet, didn't ask permission, prowled around at night, and sometimes stared at empty corners like they were in on a secret. That made them suspicious, and in times of plague, suspicion was a death sentence. Cats got tied to witches, demons, heresy, and general moral decay, none of which, as it turns out, are known to carry disease. But that didn't matter. If cats were evil, and evil caused sickness, then killing cats should make things better. That was the logic. That was the science. So communities started wiping them out by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, with confidence, with ceremony, with the full moral certainty of people who were absolutely, catastrophically wrong. What they didn't realize was that cats were also the main predators of rats, and rats, they were the real VIPs in the plague party. With cats gone, rat populations exploded. Rats moved into homes, grain stores, streets, and even beds like they'd been given a lifetime membership. Fleas followed. Fleas thrived, and the plague spread faster than ever. At no point did anyone stop and say, ever since we killed all the animals that hunt rats, there are suddenly way more rats. That would have required observation, humility, and admitting a mistake, 3 things medieval crisis response had a strict policy against. Instead, the worsening plague was seen as proof that not enough cats had been eliminated, so the solution was simple: kill more cats. Sometimes dogs, too, just in case they were in on it. Anything furry, anything that didn't look like it belonged, became fair game. This wasn't just one town. Whole regions joined in. Cats were burned, drowned, driven out, or destroyed in public rituals meant to cleanse the community. The rats, meanwhile, watched from the shadows, quietly thanking humanity for the new housing market. The irony is brutal. One of humanity's oldest allies, animals that had lived beside us for thousands of years, was removed at the exact moment it was most needed, not because it failed, but because it was misunderstood. From today's view, this looks like a tragic comedy. From their view, it was righteous, necessary, and deeply spiritual. Humanity didn't just fight disease badly, it fired the one creature that was actually helping and promoted the rats to management. When bloodletting, starvation, and cat culling failed to stop the plague, medieval society reached for a new strategy: public self-harm combined with long-distance travel. Enter the Flagellants. This might be one of history's most efficient examples of good intentions doing maximum damage. Flagellants believed the plague was divine punishment. The solution: impress God with suffering. So groups of men gathered, stripped to the waist, and marched from town to town, whipping themselves with chains, leather straps, and pure enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If God sees enough blood, he'll stop the plague. This same logic had already failed in hospitals, but hope is stubborn.
These processions weren't quiet. They were loud, dramatic, and contagious, spiritually and biologically. Flagellants sang hymns, drew huge crowds, and moved straight through packed towns. Sick people joined, healthy people joined. Everyone stood close together, breathing the same air, sharing sweat, and basically everything else. The result? Wherever the Flagellants went, plague followed. Towns that had been untouched suddenly found themselves hosting a traveling festival of infection. Instead of containing disease, medieval society turned it into a touring show. Authorities sometimes tried to stop them. Some church leaders noticed that whipping yourself while spreading death wasn't actually working. But by then, the movement had its own momentum. Flagellants didn't trust doctors, priests, or officials. They trusted pain. Pain felt productive. Pain felt meaningful. Pain looked like action. And so they marched on. The psychological pull was strong. When everything feels out of control, doing something feels better than doing nothing, even if that something is making everything worse. Flagellants gave people purpose, certainty, and a sense of moral superiority, all while quietly accelerating the collapse of the population. From today's view, it's horrifying. From their view, it was devotion in motion. Humanity didn't just fail to contain disease, it organized it, scheduled it, and sent it on tour. And somehow, against all odds, people still survived long enough to eventually stop doing this. Medieval cities were marvels of human achievement. Towering walls, bustling markets, narrow streets packed with life, commerce, and, unfortunately, everyone's bodily fluids. If disease were looking for the perfect living conditions, medieval urban planning would have won an award. Cities grew fast and tall, but not smart. Houses were jammed together so tightly that neighbors could borrow salt through the window. Streets were narrow, dark, and built more for shade than sunlight. Fresh air was a luxury. Ventilation was a myth. People lived stacked on top of each other because land inside the walls was expensive. The solution? Pack humans like firewood. Multiple families crammed into single buildings. Animals lived indoors. Chickens wandered through kitchens like they owned the place. Pigs strolled the streets like tiny, grunting landlords. And honestly, they kind of were. Waste management ran on the same principle as everything else: minimal effort, maximum optimism. Trash went into the street. Chamber pots were emptied out windows, sometimes with a polite "watch out below" if you were lucky. Rain occasionally washed things away, which was considered a full sanitation system. When disease entered this environment, it didn't spread, it detonated. Close quarters meant constant contact. One cough reached 10 people. One fever meant the whole household was already infected. One sick rat meant the entire block was quietly negotiating with death by the end of the week. Isolation was almost impossible. Quarantine often meant sleeping 6 people in the same room, just a little farther from the one person coughing directly into your face. And yet, medieval cities believed density was safety. Walls kept enemies out. Crowds meant protection. The idea that humans themselves could be the threat, that was uncomfortable. Much easier to blame bad air, the stars, or moral decay than admit that living in a human beehive might have consequences. Even worse, cities attracted people during crises. When famine or war hit the countryside, peasants flooded in, desperate for food and work. Instead, they found overcrowding, disease, and a fast-track introduction to urban mortality. From the outside, medieval cities looked impressive. From the inside, they worked like slow-moving incubators. Humanity didn't just suffer from disease, it lovingly built the perfect environment for it, brick by brick, wall by wall, person by person. And still, cities kept growing, because despite everything, most people preferred dying together inside the walls than outside them. Once medieval society accepted that disease wasn't staying politely inside city limits, it needed something to blame. Unfortunately, germs were invisible, and medieval people didn't trust invisible things unless they were angels, demons, or saints who seemed deeply disappointed in your life choices. So instead of fighting disease, they fought people. When plague struck, logic packed its bags and left town. Fear took over, and fear needed a target. Witches, heretics, foreigners, beggars, healers, midwives, and anyone slightly unusual suddenly became suspicious. If you lived alone, knew herbs, spoke differently, or had a cat before Chapter 4 happened to it,
Congratulations, you were now a public health threat. Entire communities became convinced that burning the wrong people would somehow disinfect reality itself. Fires were lit, trials were rushed, evidence was optional, confessions were encouraged enthusiastically. The logic was simple. If we destroy the source of evil, the sickness will stop. The plague, unfortunately, did not attend these meetings. This strategy had several problems. First, it removed people who were often useful. Midwives and healers were targeted precisely because they were present during illness. Killing them didn't reduce disease, it reduced care. Second, executions created crowds, large, tightly packed, emotionally charged crowds, exactly the kind of environment disease loved. Third, persecution caused panic. People fled towns to avoid accusations, carrying disease with them into new regions. Others hid symptoms, afraid that coughing too loudly might earn them a trial. Silence replaced honesty, and illness spread quietly behind closed doors. Worst of all, this created a dangerous feedback loop. When disease got worse, it was taken as proof that guilt hadn't been punished enough. So more people were accused, more fires were lit, more communities tore themselves apart in the middle of an epidemic. From today's view, this looks monstrous. From their view, it looked like action. It felt righteous. It gave people the illusion of control in a world where everything else was collapsing. Humanity didn't just misunderstand disease, it declared war on imaginary enemies and, in the process, helped extinction along quite efficiently. The plague didn't need to fight humans. Humans did most of the work themselves. When medieval medicine wasn't busy removing blood or banning vegetables, it turned to its next great idea: poison. Not accidental poison, intentional, measured, doctor-approved poison. Because if disease was strong, the cure clearly needed to be stronger, ideally lethal, but in a controlled way. Medieval hospitals were less healing centers and more experimental hazard zones. Remedies included mercury, arsenic, lead, sulfur, and various mysterious powders scraped from rocks that had never helped anyone, ever. These substances were believed to purge illness by forcing it out violently. Vomiting, sweating, diarrhea, all excellent signs. If you felt worse, the medicine was working. Mercury was especially popular. It was shiny, mysterious, and deeply toxic. 3 qualities medieval people found very convincing. Doctors prescribed it for skin diseases, parasites, and general bad vibes. Patients who survived the illness often didn't survive the cure. Those who did were rewarded with nerve damage, madness, and a shortened life expectancy, a win by medieval standards. Lead was everywhere: pipes, plates, cups, cookware, cosmetics, even medicine. Wine was sometimes sweetened with lead compounds, which gave it a pleasant taste and slowly poisoned anyone who drank it regularly. Entire communities suffered chronic lead poisoning without realizing it, mistaking the symptoms for divine punishment or melancholy. Arsenic had a dual career as both medicine and murder weapon. In tiny doses, it was believed to restore balance. In slightly larger doses, it restored silence. Unfortunately, medieval measurement tools weren't precise. The difference between healing and fatal was often a strong guess and a prayer. What made this especially dangerous was trust. These poisons weren't random guesses. They came from authority figures, doctors, monks, scholars, people who were trained, respected,
and absolutely certain they knew what they were doing.
Patients didn't question them. Why would they? Refusing medicine wasn't skepticism, it was irresponsible. If you died, it meant the disease was stronger than the cure. No one seriously considered the alternative, that the cure might be killing you. During epidemics, poison treatments exploded. Desperate people swallowed anything that was handed to them. If one remedy failed, doctors tried another, often stacking poisons on top of poisons, turning sickbeds into uncontrolled chemistry experiments with zero safety rules. From today's view, this is horrifying. From their view, it was cutting-edge science. Humanity didn't just fight disease blindly, it fought it with toxins, then patted itself on the back for being proactive. At a certain point in medieval epidemics, death simply outpaced the system. People didn't stop dying, they just stopped being handled properly. And when a society can't keep up with its dead, things get ugly, fast. During major outbreaks, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Graveyards filled, churches overflowed, coffins became a luxury. Eventually, corpses were stacked in homes, in streets, in public spaces, like unwanted furniture no one knew what to do with. This wasn't disrespect, it was exhaustion. Normally, burial involved ritual, care, and a clear distance between the living and the dead. During epidemics, that distance vanished. Families kept dead relatives indoors for days, sometimes longer, waiting for priests, gravediggers, or anyone brave enough to help. The air inside homes grew thick. The smell made it clear that something had gone very wrong with the idea of indoors. Mass graves became the emergency solution. Trenches were dug in a hurry, often near towns, rivers, or wells, because digging far away took time, energy, and optimism, all of which were in short supply. Bodies were layered quickly, covered thinly, and forgotten out of necessity, not neglect. This created a problem medieval people didn't understand, but definitely experienced. Decay seeped into water sources, insects multiplied, animals dug up the dead. Rain carried everything downhill. Disease didn't just spread, it soaked back into daily life like a terrible memory that refused to leave.
Ironically, fear of the dead made things worse. People believed corpses carried spiritual danger, so they avoided touching them. That delayed burials even further. The dead became untouchable, while the living kept sharing the same spaces, breathing the same air, drinking the same water. In some towns, carts rolled through the streets to collect bodies. The call was simple and efficient: bring out your dead. People obeyed quietly because arguing took energy they didn't have. Death became routine, familiar, almost administrative. And yet, despite all of this, the response was rarely, "We need to change how we handle this." It was more often, "This is horrible, therefore it must be inevitable." From today's view, leaving corpses among the living looks catastrophic. From their view, it was unavoidable. No one had the systems, the manpower, or the knowledge to do better. Not yet. Humanity didn't just struggle against death, it lived beside it, slept near it, and slowly learned the hard way that ignoring decay doesn't make it go away. At some point, medieval people noticed a troubling pattern. When one person got sick, everyone around them soon followed. The observation was correct. The conclusion they drew from it, however, was complicated. Isolation felt cruel, uncaring, unchristian, borderline suspicious. If someone was ill, the moral response wasn't distance, it was closeness.
Family members gathered around the sickbed, friends visited, neighbors stopped by to offer prayers, advice, and, unintentionally, germs. Leaving someone alone during illness felt like abandonment, and medieval society took abandonment very seriously. So instead of isolating the sick, people did the opposite. They crowded in. Entire households slept in the same room, often in the same bed. Sick children were held constantly. Dying parents were surrounded by relatives. This wasn't negligence, it was love. Unfortunately, disease doesn't respect love. Disease sees love and thinks, excellent, more hosts. Medical advice didn't help. Doctors rarely recommended separation. In fact, some believed that fresh company lifted the spirits and therefore helped recovery, which might be emotionally true, but biologically disastrous. A single infected person could quietly pass illness to an entire household within days. Even worse, medieval homes were small, poorly ventilated, and filled with smoke. Windows were tiny or non-existent. Fires burned constantly. Air barely moved. If disease wanted to linger, medieval cottages offered premium accommodations. Quarantine, as a concept, did exist, sort of. Some cities experimented with isolating ships or travelers, but these measures were inconsistent and often ignored. Merchants argued, clergy protested, people slipped in and out anyway. Rules collapsed the moment they became inconvenient. And then there was fear. People worried that isolating the sick might anger God, who had clearly sent illness for a reason. If disease was punishment, pulling away from it might look like avoidance, and avoidance might bring down even worse punishment later. Better to endure together than to offend divine authority. From today's view, this is painful to watch. From their view, it was compassion in action. Humanity didn't just fail to contain illness, it embraced it, held its hand, and whispered, "We'll get through this together." And they did, just not all of them. Even when medieval people weren't actively starving themselves on doctors' orders, they were still quietly losing the long war against nutrition. For most of the population, hunger wasn't a crisis, it was a background hum, a constant, low-level, not quite enough, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The average medieval diet was repetitive, seasonal, and aggressively beige.
Bread was the foundation of life. If you were lucky, it was fresh. If not, it was hard enough to double as a weapon or a brick. Vegetables came and went with the seasons. Meat was rare, saved for special occasions, holidays, or when an animal died at an inconvenient time and had to be eaten fast. This meant most people lived in a permanent state of nutritional deficiency. They weren't starving in a dramatic, sudden way. They were starving slowly, quietly, politely. The kind of hunger that doesn't kill you outright, it just makes you weaker, shorter, sicker, and far less capable of surviving the next disaster. Children grew up underfed, their bodies adapted by growing less. Shorter stature, weaker bones, and compromised immune systems became normal. Adults carried those deficits into adulthood, where a minor infection could become fatal simply because the body had nothing left to fight with. Then came the bad years, crop failure, harsh winters, war, floods. Famine didn't arrive alone. It arrived on top of a population already worn thin. People who had survived decades of almost enough suddenly faced definitely not enough,
and bodies that had been running on empty had nothing left to give. Ironically, the social response often made things worse. During shortages, people hoarded, markets collapsed, prices spiked, the poor were priced out of survival while watching food exist just out of reach. Malnutrition turned into mass death, not because food didn't exist, but because access didn't. And through it all, hunger was normalized. People didn't complain much. Complaining implied expectation, and expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From today's view, this looks like systemic failure. From their view, it was life as designed. Humanity didn't just face famine, it lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse, and somehow survived, thin, tired, and astonishingly resilient. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, medieval warfare was always waiting patiently in the background, sharpening a sword and burning a village just to stay busy. War in the Middle Ages wasn't a brief interruption of peace. It was a lifestyle, a recurring subscription humanity never managed to cancel. Medieval wars rarely ended cleanly. Armies didn't fight one decisive battle and politely go home. They marched back and forth across the same countryside for years, sometimes decades, destroying the exact resources civilians needed to survive. Crops were trampled or burned, wells were poisoned, livestock was stolen or slaughtered. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy, it was to make the land itself unlivable. For peasants, this meant famine on demand. You could survive disease one year, hunger the next, and then wake up to find soldiers calmly turning your entire livelihood into ashes because your village happened to exist between two arguing nobles. Armies were also excellent disease delivery systems. Soldiers lived in close quarters, traveled constantly, and brought sickness wherever they went. When they passed through towns, they didn't just take food and shelter, they left behind infections. War didn't pause plagues, it distributed them. Civilians fled violence into forests or cities, creating overcrowding wherever they went. Refugees packed into already struggling towns, pushing sanitation and food systems past collapse. Cities became pressure cookers of hunger, fear, and disease. And when wars finally paused, the damage didn't magically disappear. Fields took years to recover. Seed grain had been eaten. Tools were gone. Skilled laborers were dead. Even peace was exhausting. What made this especially dangerous was frequency. Medieval people didn't experience one war per generation. They experienced several. Border conflicts, succession wars, feuds, crusades. Conflict was constant enough that recovery often never fully happened before the next disaster arrived. From today's view, this looks like systemic madness. From their view, it was normal politics. Humanity didn't just suffer war, it normalized it, built systems around it, and then wondered why populations kept collapsing. That medieval people survived at all is less a testament to strategy and more a testament to sheer stubborn refusal to disappear. Medieval homes were warm, smoky, and deeply committed to damaging your lungs. Fire was essential for survival, but medieval architecture treated smoke like a mild suggestion rather than a lethal problem. Chimneys were optional. Ventilation was theoretical. Fresh air was something you only experienced briefly while stepping outside to fetch water and silently question your life choices. Most peasant homes had an open fire in the center of the room. The smoke from that fire didn't exit cleanly. It lingered. It curled around the rafters, sank back down, and filled the space with a thick, stinging haze that made your eyes water and your throat feel like it had personally offended the fire. This wasn't seen as dangerous. It was seen as cozy. People lived, slept, cooked, and worked in this environment every day. Children grew up breathing smoke the way modern people breathe city air. Coughing was normal. Burning eyes were normal. Headaches were normal. If you couldn't see clearly across the room, that just meant the fire was doing its job. Over time, this constant exposure took its toll. Chronic respiratory problems were everywhere. Lungs weakened. Immune systems suffered. When epidemics hit, these damaged lungs became perfect entry points for illness. What might have been survivable in a healthier body became fatal in one already struggling to breathe. Ironically, smoke was also believed to be protective. Some people thought it purified the air or drove away evil influences. So when disease appeared, the solution was sometimes more smoke, extra fires, more incense, less oxygen. If the plague didn't get you, the atmosphere might. And remember, homes were small. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed, wrapped in blankets soaked with smoke. Night after night, lungs absorbed particles that modern doctors would describe with words like extremely concerning. From today's view, medieval indoor living looks like a public health disaster. From their view, it was survival. Cold killed faster than smoke, at least in the short term. The long-term consequences were someone else's problem, usually future you. Humanity didn't just warm itself, it slowly smoked itself and then wondered why breathing felt optional during epidemics. The miracle isn't that medieval people suffered from respiratory illness. The miracle is that they survived long enough to eventually invent chimneys that actually worked. One of the most dangerous things medieval people ever did wasn't burning cats, drinking sewage, or bleeding patients until they fainted. It was something far quieter, far more persistent. They trusted tradition more than evidence. And tradition, unfortunately, had a very impressive body count. In medieval society, knowledge wasn't something you tested, it was something you inherited. If an idea was old, it was correct. If it came from an authority figure, it was unquestionable. And if it had killed people before, that was clearly unrelated and probably God's fault. Bloodletting worked because Galen said it worked. Dietary restrictions mattered because Aristotle had opinions. Questioning these figures wasn't curiosity, it was arrogance. And arrogance, everyone knew, was much more dangerous than dying of preventable illness. Observation did happen. People noticed patterns all the time. They saw that certain treatments made patients worse. They noticed that some towns got sicker more often than others. They realized that certain water sources caused problems. But observation without permission meant nothing. If what you saw contradicted tradition, tradition won, and tradition always won. A healer who suggested something new risked ridicule, punishment, or accusations of heresy. A doctor who ignored accepted methods could lose status or livelihood. Even being right didn't protect you. In fact, being right too early was suspicious. Why were you questioning wisdom passed down for generations? What were you hiding? This created a world where deadly ideas survived longer than people. Practices that harmed patients continued simply because they had always been done. Progress moved at the speed of copying manuscripts by candlelight, and only if the copier approved of the idea. The truly dangerous part was confidence. Medieval society wasn't uncertain. It was deeply, calmly sure of itself. It believed it understood the world, illness, and God's intentions. And that certainty delayed improvement far longer than ignorance ever could have. From today's view, this looks like stubbornness. From their view, it was respect. Respect for elders, for tradition, for authority, even when that authority was quietly leading everyone toward extinction. Humanity didn't just struggle against nature. It handcuffed itself to old ideas and refused to let go, even as the cost became painfully obvious. By the end of it all, the most astonishing thing about medieval humanity isn't how close it came to extinction. It's that it didn't actually manage to pull it off. Given the bloodletting, starvation, poisoned medicine, sewage drinking, cat extermination, plague parades, crowded cities, endless wars, smoky lungs, and unwavering loyalty to terrible ideas, survival should not have been on the table.
And yet, here we are. Medieval people didn't survive because their systems worked. They survived because humans are remarkably stubborn creatures who keep reproducing even when everything else is going wrong. Survival wasn't engineered. It wasn't planned. It happened in the cracks between disasters, in the pauses between bad decisions, in moments where someone accidentally did the right thing for the wrong reason. Progress came slowly, and usually by accident. Someone, somewhere, noticed that keeping sick people apart sometimes worked. Someone realized that certain wells or streams seemed to make people ill. Someone quietly stopped bleeding patients because too many of them died immediately afterward. These weren't sweeping revolutions. They slipped in gradually, often without anyone fully understanding why, long before the theories caught up with the practice. What really kept medieval people alive wasn't brilliance, it was adaptation under pressure. When a habit became so deadly that it threatened entire communities, it eventually softened, shifted, or just faded away. Not because society stood up and admitted we were wrong, but because pretending nothing was wrong became impossible. And even then, every inch of change was fought. The Middle Ages aren't just a story of ignorance waiting to be replaced by enlightenment. They're a story of people trapped inside belief systems that once made sense, slowly realizing those same systems were now killing them, and then arguing about it for several hundred years. From our angle, it's easy to laugh. From a historical angle, it's unsettling. Because medieval people weren't uniquely foolish. They were doing what humans always do, trusting what feels familiar, obeying authority, clinging to explanations that offer comfort, and avoiding uncertainty at almost any cost. They nearly wiped themselves out, not because they were weak, but because changing how you think is harder than surviving yet another bad year. In the end, humanity didn't crawl out of the Middle Ages through genius alone. It got out by staying alive long enough to start doubting itself.
And honestly, that's still how things work now. At the center of Norse belief stood a tree, not as a metaphor, but as the actual framework holding reality together. For the Vikings, the universe wasn't an empty void full of distant stars. It was alive, organic, and fragile, bound together by a vast ash tree whose roots and branches reached into every corner of existence. If Yggdrasil failed, everything failed. The tree rose from the depths, its trunk impossibly huge, its bark worn by ages older than memory. Its branches stretched outward and upward, cradling worlds like heavy fruit. These branches didn't simply sway in the wind, they groaned under the weight of fate itself. The Vikings imagined a universe you could hear, creaking, straining, slowly wearing down. Yggdrasil was not calm or kindly. It was under siege. Serpents gnawed at its roots, a dragon chewed constantly at its base, deer stripped its leaves. Decay wasn't a glitch in the system, it was part of the design. To the Norse mind, existence was never stable, never secure, never permanent. Even the structure holding everything together was slowly dying. At Yggdrasil's roots lay sacred wells, each tied to a fundamental principle of reality. One was the well of wisdom, fiercely guarded and paid for in sacrifice. Another was the well of fate, where the destinies of gods and humans alike were carved into being. These waters fed the tree, but they also reminded the gods that knowledge and destiny always came with a price. Crucially, Yggdrasil didn't divide gods from humans or the living from the dead. Everything was threaded through the same structure. The Vikings saw themselves not as observers looking up at the cosmos, but as figures standing on one of the tree's branches. Their lives mattered not because they were protected, but because they were exposed. This worldview shaped everything. If the cosmos itself was fragile, then struggle was normal. If even the gods couldn't stop decay, then courage mattered more than survival. Yggdrasil taught that existence was temporary, interconnected, and constantly under threat, and that meaning didn't come from lasting forever, but from how you carried yourself while the tree was still standing. From Yggdrasil's roots and branches emerged the 9 worlds, each a complete reality, but never truly separate from the others. To the Vikings, the universe wasn't stacked neatly like a layer cake. It was tangled, overlapping, and occasionally leaking across its own boundaries, just like the tree that held it all together. Closest to the gods was Asgard, a walled world of great halls, feasts, and endless preparation for battle. It wasn't a gentle paradise, it was a fortress. Even the gods lived behind defenses, fully aware that one day someone would come to tear them down. Asgard rested high among Yggdrasil's branches, but height didn't mean safety, it meant responsibility. Below lay Midgard, the realm of humans. Midgard wasn't central because humanity was special, it was central because humanity was exposed. Surrounded by oceans and encircled by a colossal serpent, Midgard was ringed by chaos. The Vikings believed their world was always in danger, perched between order and ruin, never truly secure. Beyond Midgard were harsher lands. Jotunheim was the realm of giants, ancient beings who embodied raw forces, storms, winter, wild nature, things too big to control. Giants weren't evil in a moral sense, they were inevitable. Blizzards, earthquakes, harsh seasons, and famine all belonged to them. The struggle between gods and giants wasn't about good versus evil, it was about structure versus collapse. Far below, around the roots of the tree, lay darker realms. Niflheim was a world of cold, mist, and stillness, while hell received those who died without glory. Death here wasn't a punishment, it was a destination, just another path on the tree. And none of these worlds were fully sealed.
Gods crossed into human lands. Giants stormed divine halls. Monsters broke through when balance slipped. The Vikings believed reality was porous, always at risk of being breached. To live within the 9 worlds was to live with constant uncertainty. You were never truly isolated. You were part of a system that could shift, crack, or collapse at any time. The 9 worlds taught the Vikings that everything existed in connection, that no realm, not even the gods, stood alone. At the center of their cosmos stood Odin, not as a gentle father, but as a restless seeker who ruled through knowledge, sacrifice, and fear. To the Norse, wisdom wasn't handed down like a gift. It had to be taken, stolen, or bought with pain. Odin understood this better than anyone because he paid more than all the others combined. He was obsessed with how the universe worked, and more than that, how it would end. He didn't want comfort or reassurance. He wanted truth, even when that truth promised destruction. That obsession drove him to things no other god would attempt. He gave up one of his eyes at the well of wisdom, trading part of his sight for deeper understanding. From that moment on, Odin saw less of the world, but grasped far more of it. And even that wasn't enough. He went further, hanging himself from Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, denying himself food and water. For 9 days and 9 nights he hung between life and death, not as a martyr, but as a hunter, trapping knowledge in his own suffering. From that ordeal he won the runes, symbols of power, fate, and magic that shaped reality itself. The message was clear: wisdom is born from suffering, not comfort. Odin's rule reflected that same idea. He didn't promise safety to gods or humans. He promised preparation. He sent his ravens across the worlds to gather information. He filled Valhalla not with the innocent, but with the violent, the brave, the warriors who could fight when the end came. Even death under Odin's watch became a kind of recruitment.
And crucially, Odin was not all-knowing. He knew Ragnarok was coming, but not how to stop it. His wisdom revealed limits, not solutions. That made him deeply tragic. The most knowledgeable being in the cosmos was also the one most aware of inevitable failure. To the Vikings, Odin embodied a harsh truth about existence. Understanding doesn't save you, it only prepares you. The universe wasn't built to reward goodness or punish evil. It rewarded awareness, courage, and endurance. By worshiping Odin, the Vikings accepted a worldview where pain had purpose, sacrifice had meaning, and ignorance was the greatest weakness. Odin didn't offer peace. He offered clarity, and in a universe balanced on the edge of destruction, clarity was the most valuable thing of all. In Norse mythology, the cosmos wasn't held together by harmony, it was held together by tension.
The gods themselves lived in a constant state of conflict, especially with the giants, ancient beings who represented chaos, wilderness, and forces beyond control. This struggle wasn't a moral battle between good and evil. It was a structural necessity. Without conflict, the universe would collapse. The gods of Asgard weren't immortal, perfect beings. They aged. They feared death. They relied on constant effort just to keep order from unraveling. Among them stood Thor, the blunt force of the cosmos. Where Odin sought knowledge, Thor delivered violence. His hammer wasn't a symbol of justice, it was a tool of containment. Every time he crushed a giant, he wasn't winning a war, he was delaying disaster. Thunder, storms, and earthquakes were seen as echoes of this endless struggle spilling into the human world. Opposite the gods stood the giants, beings older than Asgard itself. They weren't villains plotting domination. They were nature unbound. Harsh winters, raging seas, wild forests, and hunger all belonged to them. The giants existed to push against order, to test it, weaken it, and eventually break it. The Vikings understood that chaos couldn't be destroyed, it could only be resisted. Between these forces moved Loki, a figure who embodied instability itself. Loki wasn't loyal, nor purely hostile. He was contradiction. Sometimes he saved the gods, other times he doomed them. His cleverness created solutions, but his arrogance planted the seeds of catastrophe. To the Vikings, Loki represented the danger of intelligence without restraint, the kind of cleverness that solves one problem while creating 10 more. This constant friction shaped the universe. Peace was temporary. Victories were brief. Every feast in Asgard existed only because another battle was coming. The gods knew this. That's why they never tried to wipe out their enemies completely. Total victory would mean stagnation, and stagnation meant decay. For the Vikings, this cosmic conflict mirrored real life. Storms ruined crops, winters killed livestock, war was inevitable. Survival didn't depend on hope for lasting peace, but on strength, adaptability, and readiness. The universe, as they saw it, was a battlefield in slow motion. Order and chaos pushed against each other endlessly, and existence survived only in the narrow space between them. Above gods, giants, and humans alike ruled a force even the strongest could not challenge: fate. The Vikings believed that everything, every birth, every battle, every death, was already woven into existence. This power took the form of the Norns, 3 ancient beings who lived at the roots of Yggdrasil, quietly shaping reality itself. The Norns weren't gods. They weren't evil. They simply were. One shaped what had already happened, another shaped what was unfolding, and the third shaped what was yet to come.
Together, they carved destinies not only for humans, but for the gods themselves. Even Odin, with all his sacrifice and knowledge, couldn't rewrite what the Norns had decided. He could see fate approaching, but he could never stop it. This belief made Norse mythology brutally honest. There was no illusion of escape. Death wasn't a punishment for failure, nor was survival a reward for virtue. You lived exactly as long as you were meant to live. What mattered wasn't how long your thread lasted, but how tightly it was woven. That's why courage mattered so deeply to the Vikings. If the ending was fixed, then fear was pointless. Running from fate didn't change anything. It only wasted the time you were given. Facing it directly, weapon in hand, gave meaning to existence. A warrior who died screaming was pitied. A warrior who died standing was remembered. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Viking view of death itself.
Those who fell bravely in battle were carried to Valhalla, not to rest, but to prepare. Every day they fought, bled, and died again, only to feast and rise once more. Valhalla wasn't paradise, it was training camp for the final disaster. Fate, in the Norse view, wasn't something to dodge, it was something to meet, properly, squarely, without looking away. Even the gods knew how the story ended. They knew betrayal was coming. They knew monsters would break free. They knew the cosmos would burn. And still, they prepared.
This worldview taught the Vikings something rare and unsettling. Meaning doesn't come from winning. It comes from standing firm when defeat is certain and choosing to face the end without flinching. All of Norse cosmology bent toward one unavoidable event, Ragnarok.
This wasn't a surprise twist or a sudden catastrophe. Ragnarok was woven into creation from the very beginning. The Vikings believed the universe was born with an expiration date. Every age, every war, every omen was a slow step toward that final collapse. Ragnarok wasn't triggered by one mistake or one act of evil. It began with imbalance, bonds weakening, promises breaking, the natural order fraying. Winters grew longer, harsher. Brothers turned on brothers. The world didn't end in fire alone. It ended in moral decay. To the Vikings, social collapse and cosmic collapse were reflections of the same process. As Ragnarok approached, the monsters long held back by the gods would finally break free. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf bound by trickery, would snap his chains and devour everything in his path. His jaws were said to stretch from earth to sky, swallowing gods as easily as men. At the same time, Jormungandr, coiled around Midgard, would rise from the sea, flooding the land and poisoning the sky with his breath. From the underworld would march the dead, led by Hel, while giants stormed the heavens, crossing boundaries that once kept reality intact. Even the sun and moon would not escape. They would be devoured, plunging the world into darkness. The gods didn't misunderstand Ragnarok. They knew exactly what it meant: defeat. Not a close battle, not a tragic victory, an absolute end. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Thor would kill the world serpent, only to fall moments later, poisoned by its venom. No sacrifice, no wisdom, no strength could change that outcome. What makes Ragnarok remarkable isn't the destruction, it's the response. The gods didn't flee. They didn't beg fate for mercy. They armed themselves, gathered their allies, and marched toward a battle they knew they would lose. To the Vikings, Ragnarok wasn't a failure of the gods. It was the ultimate proof of honor. Knowing the end didn't excuse inaction. Meaning came from resistance, not survival. The universe would burn, but it would burn standing. In the Norse worldview, death wasn't the mystery to fear. It was a destination already accounted for. The universe was built with endings in mind, and death was just another transition along Yggdrasil's branches. What mattered wasn't avoiding death, but earning the right kind of ending. The most famous destination was Valhalla, Odin's great hall. But Valhalla was never meant for everyone. It was reserved for those who died bravely in battle, weapon in hand, meeting violence with defiance. Even then, Valhalla wasn't rest. The dead warriors, the Einherjar, fought each other every day, killing and being killed, only to rise again by nightfall to feast and prepare. Death wasn't the end of struggle. It was recruitment. Alongside Valhalla existed Folkvangr, ruled by Freya. Half of the fallen were said to go there instead, though little is known about what awaited them. This uncertainty mattered. The Vikings didn't obsess over mapping the afterlife.
They accepted that not everything was meant to be understood. For those who didn't die in battle, there was hell. Contrary to later Christian ideas, hell wasn't a place of punishment. It was quiet, cold, and colorless, a reflection of deaths without glory. Farmers, children, the elderly, the sick, all ended there. Their fate wasn't shameful, it was simply unremarkable. The Vikings didn't see hell as evil, they saw it as absence. This belief system created a stark moral hierarchy. Glory was earned through action, not goodness. A kind man who died quietly might be loved, but he wouldn't be celebrated. A violent man who faced death unflinching would be remembered. Memory mattered more than morality. Death rituals reflected this mindset. The dead were buried with weapons, tools, and symbols of identity, not because they used them, but because they defined who the person was. To die stripped of your story was worse than dying violently. In the end, Norse belief didn't promise justice after death. It promised recognition. You wouldn't be judged, you would be remembered or forgotten. To the Vikings, dying well meant meeting the inevitable with dignity. The universe would end, life would end, but how you faced that ending would echo longer than your breath ever could. Even after the destruction of Ragnarok, Norse mythology didn't end in silence. When the flames died down and the seas withdrew, the universe wasn't erased, it was transformed. This final belief reveals something crucial about how the Vikings understood existence. Destruction was never absolute. It was a passage, not a conclusion. After Ragnarok, the world was said to rise again from the waters, cleansed but scarred. The earth would become green once more. Crops would grow without being sown. The sky would clear. This wasn't a return to innocence. It was survival after catastrophe. The new world carried memory, not forgetfulness. Some gods would endure. Balder, whose unjust death helped trigger the end, would return from the underworld, symbolizing renewal and restored balance. His presence didn't undo the past, but it softened it. Light returned, not because darkness was defeated, but because it had already done its worst. A new generation of gods would walk the renewed world, inheriting ruins instead of palaces. They would remember the mistakes of their predecessors. Wisdom would come not from prophecy, but from experience. The universe would continue, but it would continue humbler. Humanity would survive as well. Two figures, Leif and Leifthrassir, would hide during Ragnarok and emerge afterward to repopulate the world. Their survival wasn't heroic or glorious. It was quiet, and that mattered. The Vikings understood that most survival doesn't look like legend. It looks like endurance in obscurity. This rebirth reshaped how they viewed struggle. Ragnarok wasn't a warning to behave better. It was proof that collapse was natural. Civilizations fall, gods die, worlds burn, and yet life returns. Importantly, the reborn world wasn't guaranteed to be better. It was simply another chance. Norse mythology didn't promise perfection after destruction, only continuation. The cycle could begin again, with new conflicts, new failures, and new endings waiting somewhere ahead. This belief made Norse cosmology profoundly different from later religious systems. There was no final victory, no eternal peace, just survival, memory, and repetition. And the Vikings lived knowing that even the end of everything was not the end of meaning. If something could rise again after total ruin, then enduring hardship, even briefly, was never pointless.
The fire would come, but so would the world that followed. For the Vikings, Norse mythology wasn't distant myth or abstract theology. It was a lived reality. The cosmos of Yggdrasil, the gods, the giants, fate, and Ragnarok weren't stories told for comfort. They were explanations for why life felt harsh, unpredictable, and temporary. The universe made sense precisely because it didn't promise fairness. Living inside this cosmic framework shaped how the Vikings understood themselves. They didn't see humans as insignificant, but they didn't see them as special either. Humans occupied Midgard, one branch among many, exposed to the same dangers that threatened gods and monsters alike. Storms, disease, hunger, and war weren't punishments. They were simply expressions of a universe in constant tension. This worldview produced a distinct mindset. If suffering was inevitable, then dignity mattered more than comfort. If the end was already written, then action mattered more than outcome. A man wasn't judged by whether he won, but by how he stood when everything was falling apart.
Fear was understandable, but surrender? That was shameful. Norse mythology also rejected the idea that the universe rewarded good and punished evil. There was no guarantee that decent people would thrive or that cruel ones would fall. The gods themselves lied, cheated, and failed. What separated heroes from cowards wasn't virtue, it was response. How you met hardship defined you more than the hardship itself. Even daily life followed this cosmic logic. Feasting mattered because famine was always close. Loyalty mattered because betrayal was always possible. Reputation mattered because memory was the closest thing to immortality. To be remembered was to resist oblivion, even if only for a little while. And crucially, this belief system didn't create despair, it created resilience. Knowing that even the gods would die didn't weaken faith, it strengthened resolve. If Odin himself couldn't escape fate, then humans had no reason to feel humiliated by loss. Struggle became a shared condition across all levels of existence. Norse mythology didn't offer an escape from reality, it offered alignment with it. The universe was brutal, so humans were expected to be brave. The future was uncertain, so preparation mattered. The end was guaranteed, so meaning had to be created now. To live as a Viking was to stand inside a collapsing cosmos and choose to act anyway, not because victory was certain, not because salvation waited, but because facing the storm head-on was the only honorable way to exist beneath the branches of the world tree. For most of human history, the face was something you never truly saw. You could feel it in the cold, sense it when others looked at you, recognize it through pain, scars, and expressions, but you couldn't confront it directly. Identity existed without confirmation. You knew who you were, but your own image remained largely unknown. The earliest glimpses of the self came by accident. A still pond at dawn, a dark pool after rain, a calm river that briefly stopped moving. For a moment, a face appeared, ghost-like, distorted, trembling with every breath of wind. Then it vanished. The image was never stable, never obedient. Water refused to hold the self in place. To early humans, reflection felt uncanny, almost supernatural. Seeing yourself wasn't a tool, it was an event. This absence mattered deeply. Without a fixed reflection, the sense of self was built outward, not inward. You knew who you were because of your role, your name, your lineage, your actions. Identity lived in memory and reputation, not in appearance. The body was functional, not aesthetic. It hunted, labored, healed, aged. It was not examined. This may be why so many early cultures associated reflections with spirits, souls, or other worlds. A face appearing in water felt less like confirmation and more like intrusion. Was that truly you, or something wearing your shape? In many traditions, reflections were treated cautiously, even fearfully. Looking too long could mean inviting something back with you. Crucially, the lack of mirrors meant there was no daily confrontation with flaws, no studying symmetry, no measuring youth against decay. Wrinkles arrived unnoticed. Scars became familiar through touch, not sight. Aging happened quietly. Vanity, as we understand it today, had little room to grow.
This didn't make early humans less self-aware. It made them differently aware. The self was experienced through action, not observation, through endurance, not appearance, through story, not image. The invention of the mirror would shatter this balance. But before polished stone or shining metal ever returned a stable face, humanity lived for thousands of years without knowing exactly what it looked like. And in that long stretch of time, the self was something you were, never something you stared at. The first deliberate mirrors weren't made of glass or metal. They were born from stone, dark, volcanic, sharp. Polished obsidian, used as early as 6,000 years ago, gave humanity its first reliable way to see itself without distortion. For the first time, reflection became intentional. Unlike water, obsidian didn't ripple. It didn't disappear when touched. It held the face steady. This alone was revolutionary. A human could now stand still and watch themselves remain. The image was dark, dim, and imperfect, but it was recognizably human. Still, these mirrors were rare and powerful objects. Obsidian had to be mined, shaped, and carefully polished. Not everyone owned one. In many societies, mirrors were tied to ritual, status, and authority. To look into one wasn't casual, it was meaningful. Reflection was something you prepared for. Psychologically, this changed everything. The moment a person saw their own face clearly, they gained distance from themselves. You were no longer only inside your body, you could observe it. This created a split that had never fully existed before, the observer and the observed. The self became something you could inspect. This likely felt unsettling. Early mirror users weren't trained to interpret their own appearance. Seeing your face reversed, staring back silently, may have felt confrontational, even threatening.
Many cultures treated mirrors as spiritual tools, portals, or objects capable of holding souls. Breaking a mirror wasn't just damage, it was danger. Obsidian mirrors were often used in ceremonies, divination, and burial rites.
They were associated with truth, but also with otherworldliness. The dark surface didn't flatter, it didn't shine brightly. It absorbed light, giving reflections a shadowed, almost dreamlike quality. Seeing yourself in obsidian was less about beauty and more about recognition. For the first time, humans could notice asymmetry. One eye slightly higher, a scar shaped differently than remembered, facial expressions seen rather than felt. This introduced a new kind of self-awareness, visual self-awareness, and with it came the earliest seeds of self-consciousness. Once the face could be studied, it could be judged. Once it could be judged, it could be compared. Obsidian mirrors didn't just show people who they were. They quietly introduced the idea that the self could be evaluated from the outside. As societies learned to shape metal, mirrors evolved from dark stone into shining bronze. These new mirrors reflected more light, more detail, and more authority. Unlike obsidian, bronze mirrors were bright, deliberate, and unmistakably man-made. They didn't feel mystical in the same way. They felt controlled. Bronze mirrors first appeared in ancient civilizations across Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Mediterranean world. They were expensive, fragile, and difficult to maintain. Polishing was constant. Tarnish was inevitable. Owning a mirror now meant labor, time spent polishing, preserving your own reflection. That alone turned mirrors into symbols of status. Most people still lived their entire lives without ever seeing their own face clearly. Mirrors belonged to the elite, priests, nobles, rulers. Reflection became selective. Who got to see themselves, and how often, was tied directly to power. To know your face was, in a sense, a privilege. Psychologically, bronze mirrors introduced something new: image management. Unlike obsidian, bronze offered clarity. Expressions were readable, features sharper. The face became something that could be adjusted, hair arranged, jewelry placed with intention. The body began to be curated, not just inhabited. This mattered deeply in hierarchical societies. Rulers understood that appearance communicated authority. A controlled face suggested control over the world. Calm expressions signaled dominance. Mirrors allowed the powerful to rehearse themselves, to align their outward image with the role they needed to play. At the same time, bronze mirrors quietly intensified self-scrutiny. The brighter the reflection, the harder it was to ignore flaws. Lines, scars, asymmetries, all became visible. The mirror didn't just show who you were, it showed how you might be seen by others. The self became public, even in private. Many cultures responded with ritual boundaries. Mirrors were covered when not in use. Reflections were avoided at night. Looking too long was discouraged. These weren't just superstitions. They were psychological safeguards. The human mind was still adjusting to the shock of seeing itself so clearly. Bronze mirrors also reinforced gender roles.
Women, in particular, were increasingly tied to reflection, grooming, and appearance. The mirror became a tool of expectation as much as self-knowledge.
To be seen was to be judged. To prepare was to survive socially. With bronze, the mirror stopped being a rare confrontation and became a tool of identity maintenance. The self was no longer just discovered, it was maintained. The invention of glass mirrors transformed reflection from a privilege into a habit. Unlike obsidian or bronze, glass didn't darken the face or distort it through uneven polish. It returned an image that felt precise, stable, and unforgiving. For the first time, humans could see themselves as others likely saw them, clearly, repeatedly, and without ceremony. Early glass mirrors were still rare, but once production improved, reflection slowly moved into daily life. Homes, workshops, and later public spaces began to contain mirrors. The self was no longer encountered occasionally, it was encountered constantly. This repetition changed the human mind. With glass mirrors came accuracy. Pores, wrinkles, tiny shifts in expression became visible. There was no shadow to hide behind, no blur to soften the image. The face stopped being symbolic and became anatomical.
People began to recognize themselves not just as roles or reputations, but as visible objects in the world. This precision intensified self-awareness into self-monitoring. You could now check your appearance at will, adjust your posture, practice expressions, smile until it looked convincing, frown to see how it landed. The mirror became a rehearsal space for social interaction. Identity became something you could practice before presenting it. Psychologically, this marked a major shift.
The self was no longer something that emerged only through experience. It was something managed through observation. The internal sense of who you were began to compete with the external image staring back at you. For some, this created control. For others, anxiety. Glass mirrors also changed how time was experienced. Aging, once gradual and easy to ignore, became visible day by day. A new line here, a slight sag there. The mirror introduced comparison, not only with others, but with your past self. Memory gained a visual rival. Importantly, mirrors didn't just reveal reality, they standardized it. A normal face began to exist. Symmetry became desirable. Deviations became noticeable. Beauty standards, once fluid and cultural, started to harden around what the mirror consistently showed. The mirror was no longer neutral. It became an authority. This didn't happen because glass mirrors were cruel, but because they were consistent. They showed the same face every day, whether you felt strong or weak, confident or afraid. They offered no emotional filter. With glass, humanity crossed a threshold. The self became something that could be observed, corrected, compared, and perfected. And once reflection became precise, it became impossible to unsee. Once mirrors became common, something subtle but profound happened inside the human mind. People began to live with a constant double, the self that acted and the self that watched.
This division didn't require philosophy or education. It emerged naturally the moment reflection became routine. Before mirrors, self-awareness was mostly internal. You felt embarrassment, pride, confidence, or shame without seeing yourself express it. With mirrors, emotion gained a visual component. You could now watch yourself being afraid, watch yourself smile, watch yourself age. The mind learned to step outside the body and look back in. This created a new psychological tension. The person you felt yourself to be didn't always match the person you saw. Someone might feel strong, but look tired. Feel confident, but see hesitation in their eyes. The mirror exposed the gap between inner identity and outer appearance, forcing the brain to reconcile the two. Over time, this trained people to anticipate how they appeared, even when no mirror was present. You began to imagine yourself from the outside. How am I standing? How do I look when I speak? What expression am I wearing right now? The mirror no longer needed to be physically present. It had been internalized. This was a turning point in human psychology. Self-surveillance became normal. Behavior was adjusted not just by rules or fear of punishment, but by imagined observation. The mirror taught people to see themselves as objects in a social space. This shift had real benefits. It deepened empathy. If you could imagine how you looked, you could start to imagine how others felt. Social awareness sharpened. Communication became more subtle, more intentional.
But it came with a cost. The mirror made comparison unavoidable. Once you could see yourself clearly, you could compare yourself to others just as clearly. Beauty, youth, strength, symmetry, these became measurable in ways they never had been before. The mind began ranking the self, sometimes with quiet cruelty. Importantly, mirrors didn't invent insecurity out of nothing. They amplified it. They gave shape to doubts that had once been vague, floating feelings. A sense of not being enough could now latch on to a visible detail, a crooked tooth, a tired eye, a line that hadn't been there last season. Over time, this created a split. The lived self, the one feeling, acting, reacting, and the observed self, the one being watched, became a permanent feature of human consciousness. You were no longer just being, you were watching yourself be. The mirror didn't invent self-judgment, it gave it a face to focus on. As mirrors became woven into daily life, they gained symbolic weight far beyond their physical function. Across cultures, mirrors came to stand for truth, but not the comforting kind. They were believed to reveal what couldn't be hidden, not just on the surface, but beneath it. The reflection was honest, silent, and impossible to argue with. That's why mirrors became tangled with superstition, fear, and taboo. Many societies believed mirrors could trap souls, invite spirits, or expose inner corruption. Looking too long was said to be dangerous. Covering mirrors after a death became common, not just to avoid bad luck, but to protect the living from confronting absence too directly. A reflection in a house of mourning felt wrong.
Psychologically, this fear makes sense. A mirror doesn't react, it doesn't reassure, it simply returns what's in front of it. This can feel unsettling because humans are wired to read intention in faces. A face that looks back without emotion breaks that expectation. It feels inhuman.
Mirrors also forced confrontation with change. You could lie to yourself about who you were becoming, but the mirror couldn't. Each day, it quietly documented decline, growth, stress, exhaustion. This gave mirrors a reputation for cruelty, even though they were doing nothing more than recording time. In religious and philosophical traditions, mirrors became tools for self-examination. To look at yourself was to face truth stripped of story. No excuse, no narrative, just presence. Some embraced this, others avoided it. The mirror became a test. Interestingly, mirrors were rarely treated as neutral objects. They were decorated, framed, ritualized, or hidden. Humans tried to soften the psychological impact by controlling the context in which reflection happened. Even today, lighting and angles matter. We instinctively manipulate mirrors to manage how much truth we're willing to receive. Mirrors also created anxiety around identity. If your reflection changed, did that mean you had changed? Or had you always been that way, only now noticing? The mirror introduced doubt into self-perception. The self was no longer stable, it was observable, and therefore questionable. This tension made mirrors powerful devices in myth and storytelling. They revealed monsters, truths, curses, transformations, not because they caused change, but because they revealed it. The fear around mirrors was never really about superstition. It was about being seen by something that couldn't be persuaded, negotiated with, or fooled. As mirrors became more widespread, they quietly shifted from tools of awareness into tools of discipline. Reflection stopped being something you encountered occasionally and became something built into daily routines. You didn't just see yourself, you checked yourself. This is where the mirror began to shape behavior before it happened. You adjusted your posture preemptively. You softened expressions. You corrected habits, not because someone else was watching, but because you imagined how you'd look if they were. The mirror trained anticipation over time. This created a powerful feedback loop. The body acted, the mirror reflected, the mind evaluated, the body adjusted again. Identity became something constantly edited. The self was no longer static, it was a draft. This had profound social consequences. Norms of appearance hardened. Cleanliness, grooming, posture, facial expression all became moralized. Looking put together implied discipline. Looking unkempt implied failure. The mirror helped turn appearance into evidence of character. Crucially, this control didn't need authority figures to enforce it. No ruler had to command it. The mirror did the work silently. Once standards were internalized, people enforced them on themselves. Shame became private. Correction became automatic. This is why mirrors flourished alongside urbanization and complex societies. Large populations need predictability. Mirrors helped create it. When people monitored themselves, they tended to behave in more socially acceptable ways. The mirror became part of the machinery of order. But this also narrowed what it meant to be normal. Difference became more visible. Deviation became harder to ignore. Bodies that didn't fit expectations were no longer just different, they were visibly different. The mirror didn't invent exclusion, but it made exclusion measurable. Psychologically, this intensified self-criticism. The mind learned to scan for flaws the way a guard scans for threats. Even in moments of rest, The internal mirror stayed active. You were never fully off stage. And yet, people also learned to use mirrors strategically. Performers, leaders, negotiators, anyone who needed to influence others used reflection to craft presence. The mirror could train confidence as much as insecurity. It sharpened self-awareness into self-command. By this point, the mirror was no longer a passive object. It shaped posture, emotion, and behavior long before action happened. Humans weren't just seeing themselves, they were governing themselves through the image that stared back. At some point, the mirror stopped needing to be in the room at all. Its function had already moved inside the mind. People learned to picture themselves constantly from angles they could never physically see. This was the final transformation of reflection. The mirror became internal.
You began to imagine how you looked while speaking, walking, laughing, even while alone. The self was now accompanied by an invisible observer, always present, always evaluating. This was no longer about appearance alone. It extended to behavior, emotion, and thought. Am I acting correctly? Am I reacting the right way? Do I look like the person I believe myself to be? This internal mirror reshaped identity at its deepest level. Personality became performative even in private. You didn't just feel anger, you watched yourself feel it. You didn't just experience joy, you assessed how it looked. Emotional life gained a second layer, observation. This brought clarity for some. Self-reflection allowed growth, restraint, and intentional change. You could notice harmful patterns and correct them. You could rehearse courage. You could become more than impulse. But it also carried a cost. When the observer never turns off, rest becomes difficult. Silence becomes crowded. Even solitude feels public. The mind loses its ability to simply be without commentary. This is where the mirror's psychological power becomes most intense. The self splits again, not between body and image, but between experience and judgment. You are no longer just living moments, you are evaluating them in real time. Modern anxiety thrives here. The fear of being seen persists even when no one is watching. The internal mirror does not blink. It does not get tired. It does not forgive easily. It remembers old reflections and compares them to new ones. And yet, this inward turn also enables deep self-knowledge. Without the mirror, there is no introspection. Without introspection, there is no deliberate identity. The same tool that creates insecurity also creates consciousness. This is the paradox of reflection. The mirror fragments the self, but it also allows the self to be shaped intentionally. It can trap you in endless self-criticism, or it can offer awareness powerful enough to change behavior. By this stage, humanity no longer needed polished stone, metal, or glass to see itself. The mirror had become a permanent feature of the human mind, watching, questioning, and defining who we believe ourselves to be. The invention of the mirror gave humanity something no other tool ever had: the ability to confront the self directly and repeatedly. It didn't add strength, speed, or survival skills.
It added awareness, and awareness changed everything. Once humans could see themselves clearly, identity became something visible. The self could be examined, improved, doubted, and reshaped. This brought growth. It allowed empathy, self-correction, and intention. People could align how they felt with how they appeared. They could become deliberate versions of themselves. But this gift came with a cost. Seeing yourself meant judging yourself, remembering yourself, comparing yourself. The mirror made the self measurable, and measurement invites hierarchy. Beauty, youth, and symmetry became currencies. Aging became something to track instead of accept. Difference became something to explain or hide. The mirror didn't invent insecurity, vanity, or shame, but it gave them a fixed reference point. Doubt gained a surface. Fear gained a face. The self became both subject and object, actor and audience. This tension is still unresolved.
Modern life is saturated with reflections, literal and digital. Screens, cameras, and profiles extend the mirror endlessly. The question introduced by the first polished stone has never gone away. Who am I really? The one I feel myself to be, or the one I see? The mirror offers no answer. It never did. It only shows. And yet, without it, much of what we call selfhood would not exist. The ability to recognize yourself is the foundation of responsibility, memory, and choice. The mirror fractured the self, but it also made it conscious. In the end, the invention of the mirror did not simply allow humans to see their faces. It forced them to live with themselves as visible beings in the world. To be human now means to carry that reflection everywhere, sometimes as insight, sometimes as burden. The mirror remains what it always was, silent, precise, and indifferent. It does not tell you who you are. It only asks you to look. By the late Renaissance, Italy was saturated with beauty and restless because of it. Painting had reached astonishing realism. Architecture had learned to command space and emotion. Poetry could shape entire worlds with language alone. Yet music, for all its sophistication, still hovered on the edges of storytelling. It enhanced moments, but it did not yet carry them. Music existed everywhere, but rarely at the center. In churches, it elevated prayer. In courts, it flattered power. In streets and taverns, it entertained. What it did not do, at least not fully, was sustain drama. Characters did not live and change through music. Stories were spoken or sung, but never truly embodied by sound.
Scholars believed that Greek tragedy had fused poetry, music, and performance into one overwhelming experience. Not background music, not decorative song, but voices carrying emotion, narrative, and meaning all at once. Historical accuracy didn't matter as much as the longing it created. Renaissance intellectuals didn't just want to study the past, they wanted to resurrect it. They imagined ancient audiences moved to tears by sung drama, emotions shaped as much by melody as by words. Italy was uniquely ready for this experiment. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Mantua were wealthy, fiercely competitive, and obsessed with cultural prestige.
Patrons craved novelty. Artists craved freedom. Philosophers craved proof that art could reshape the human soul. There was also a quiet frustration with the music of the time. Polyphony, multiple voices weaving together, was technically brilliant, but emotionally confusing. Words often drowned in complexity, meaning dissolved into sound. If music was going to tell stories, something had to change. The stage was set not by one invention, but by dissatisfaction, a sense that art had reached the edge of its current form, a feeling that emotion needed clearer expression, that music needed to speak directly, not just decorate. Opera wasn't born from overconfidence, it was born from a question. What if music stopped decorating stories and started being the story? That question would reshape Western music forever. The city where this idea began to take shape was Florence, not because it was quieter or more conservative, but because it was bold enough to experiment. Florence had long seen itself as a cultural laboratory, a place where art wasn't just admired, but engineered. If a new form was going to be invented, it would happen here. At the center of this experimentation was a small group of poets, musicians, and philosophers who met in private homes, not public theaters. They were later called the Florentine Camerata. What united them wasn't a shared style, but a shared frustration. They believed contemporary music had become too complex, too tangled in technical display to express real human emotion. Their core idea was radical for its time. Music should serve the words, not overpower them. They argued that ancient Greek drama had been sung in a simple, speech-like style, where melody followed the natural rhythm of language. Whether this was historically true mattered less than the conviction behind it. They wanted music that spoke. This was dangerous territory. Renaissance music prized polyphony, the interweaving of multiple independent vocal lines. It was mathematically elegant, intellectually impressive, and deeply respected. To suggest moving away from it was to challenge centuries of tradition. Yet the Camerata pushed forward anyway. They imagined a new vocal style, a single voice carrying the text clearly, supported by minimal harmony. This approach would let listeners understand every word, every emotional shift. Music would no longer blur meaning, it would sharpen it. What they were proposing wasn't just a technical change, it was a philosophical one. They believed emotion was central to art, and that art's purpose was to move the listener's inner state. If music failed to do that, no amount of complexity could redeem it. This idea reframed the role of the performer. Singers were no longer just voices within a texture. They became characters, individuals, carriers of narrative weight. The audience, in turn, was invited to listen differently, not for cleverness, but for feeling. Florence provided the perfect environment for such a risky experiment. Wealthy patrons funded trials, small audiences tolerated failure. Artists were encouraged to test ideas, not just repeat formulas. The Florentine Camerata didn't set out to invent opera as a genre. They set out to solve a problem. And in doing so, they opened a door that could never be closed again. Ideas alone weren't enough. If music was truly going to become drama, someone had to risk putting theory on a stage. That step came at the very end of the 16th century, when composers began creating works that sat uneasily between music, speech, and theater, things that didn't yet have a name. One of the first to attempt this was Jacopo Peri, a musician working in Florence under noble patronage. Perry wasn't trying to invent a spectacle, he was testing an idea. Could a single voice, shaped like heightened speech, carry an entire story? The result was something new and strange. Instead of multiple voices weaving together, one character sang at a time. The melody followed the natural rise and fall of Italian speech, stretching certain syllables, tightening others.
This style became known as recitative. Not quite song, not quite speech, but something suspended between the two. Early audiences didn't hear these works as polished masterpieces. They heard them as experiments. The music was sparse, the accompaniment minimal, the drama intimate. But something unprecedented was happening. Characters were no longer pausing the story to sing, they were singing the story itself. This solved a major problem. Words could finally be understood, emotion could unfold in real time. Music stopped interrupting drama and started serving it. A character's hesitation, grief, or anger could now stretch across musical time instead of being spoken and forgotten. These early operas often drew on mythological subjects, especially Greek stories. This was intentional. Myth gave emotional weight without demanding realism. Audiences already knew the endings. The focus wasn't suspense, it was expression, how it felt to move toward fate. Importantly, these first works weren't written for large public theaters. They were performed in courts and private spaces for educated listeners who were willing to listen closely. Opera began not as popular entertainment, but as intellectual art. There were doubts. Some found the style monotonous, others missed the richness of polyphony. But even critics sensed something irreversible had begun. Once music learned how to speak clearly, it could no longer go back to being decorative alone. These early experiments were fragile, imperfect, and limited.
But they proved one essential thing. A human voice, given enough space and intention, could carry an entire world. The early experiments proved that sung drama was possible. What they hadn't yet proven was that it could be powerful. That transformation came with Claudio Monteverdi, the composer who turned a fragile concept into a living art form. Monteverdi understood something his predecessors only sensed. If opera was going to survive, it couldn't stay an academic experiment. It had to move people. Emotion had to come first, even if rules were broken along the way. Where earlier composers had treated music cautiously, Monteverdi treated it like a weapon, bending harmony, rhythm, and melody to serve feeling. His operas didn't just present stories, they breathed. Characters argued, begged, raged, and collapsed emotionally, and the music followed them without restraint. Dissonance was no longer a flaw, it became a tool. When a character suffered, the harmony suffered with them. When desire surged, the music stretched beyond polite boundaries. Monteverdi also expanded the orchestra's role. Instruments were no longer just support, they became emotional commentators, coloring scenes with tension, tenderness, or dread. Silence itself became meaningful. A pause could wound as deeply as a note. This shift changed how audiences experienced opera. They were no longer listening politely, they were being pulled into the inner lives of characters. Mythological figures stopped feeling distant and symbolic. They became recognizably human, capable of jealousy, fear, regret, and longing. Crucially, Monteverdi proved that clarity and richness could coexist. Words remained intelligible, but the musical world around them grew deep and expressive.
Opera no longer had to choose between intellect and emotion. It could command both. This was the turning point. After Monteverdi, opera was no longer a question mark. It was a viable, compelling form, capable of growth. Composers across Italy took notice. Courts requested new works. Experiments became expectations. Opera also began to loosen its elite grip. While still expensive and exclusive, it was no longer confined to philosophical circles. Its emotional power made it accessible even to listeners who didn't understand its theoretical origins. What Monteverdi achieved was not perfection, but momentum. He showed that opera could evolve, absorb influences, and deepen over time. Once audiences had felt music think, desire, and suffer on stage, there was no returning to simpler forms. Opera was alive now, and living things don't stay contained for long. Once opera proved it could move hearts, it needed a new home, one less restricted than princely courts and private salons. That home became Venice, a city unlike any other in Italy. Venice was wealthy, crowded, theatrical by nature, and most importantly, public. Here, opera would change forever. In Venice, opera left the world of exclusive patronage and entered the marketplace. Public opera houses began to appear, funded not by a single ruler, but by ticket sales. This single shift transformed the art form. For the first time, opera had to appeal not just to elites, but to paying audiences with varied tastes and expectations. This changed what stories were told and how they were framed. Mythological subjects remained popular, but they were reshaped for drama, spectacle, and emotional immediacy. Plots became more complex. Characters became more extreme. Love, betrayal, disguise, jealousy, and revenge dominated the stage. Opera leaned into excess because excess sold. Music adapted accordingly. Recitative still carried the story forward, but arias grew in importance. These moments allowed characters to pause the action and explore emotion in depth. The audience came to expect them. Singers became stars, admired not just for their voices, but for their personalities and expressive power. Venice also transformed staging. Opera houses invested in elaborate sets, moving scenery, and visual effects. Gods descended from the heavens, palaces collapsed, storms erupted indoors. Opera became a total sensory experience. Sound, sight, and narrative fused into something overwhelming. This commercialization worried some intellectuals. They feared opera was becoming shallow, driven by spectacle rather than philosophy. But what they missed was that opera was doing exactly what living art does, adapting to its environment. Public audiences demanded clarity, emotion, and excitement. Opera responded by sharpening its tools. Music became more direct, characters more relatable, conflict more intense. The art form didn't grow weaker, it grew stronger. Venice proved that opera didn't need protection to survive. It needed engagement. When people paid to hear stories sung, those stories gained urgency. Opera stopped being an experiment and became a cultural force. By opening its doors to the public, opera gained something crucial, a voice that belonged not just to artists or patrons, but to society itself. As opera spread across Italy, the human voice itself
became the central battlefield. Composers were no longer satisfied with simply telling stories through music. They wanted voices that could astonish, overwhelm, and suspend time. This hunger for intensity pushed singing into unfamiliar territory. Opera demanded extremes, long phrases without breath, sudden leaps across wide ranges, sustained notes that seemed to defy the limits of the body. The voice was treated not just as a natural instrument, but as something to be trained, stretched, and disciplined into submission. This gave rise to a new kind of performer, the virtuoso singer. Technique became spectacle. Audiences came not only for stories, but to witness vocal feats that bordered on the impossible. A single aria could stop the drama entirely, holding listeners in place through sheer sonic force. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the castrati. Male singers were altered before puberty to preserve high voices with adult lung power. Their voices were unlike anything else, powerful, flexible, and eerily pure. To modern ears, the practice feels brutal. To 17th century audiences, it felt miraculous. Castrati became stars. They commanded enormous fees, inspired devotion, and shaped how composers wrote music.
Roles were designed around their abilities. Emotional expression became inseparable from vocal display. Grief, love, rage, and triumph were all measured through sound pushed to its limits. This focus on vocal power changed opera's emotional language. Feelings were no longer just expressed, they were prolonged, magnified, and explored in detail. An aria could stretch a single emotion across minutes, forcing the audience to sit inside it. Opera taught listeners how to endure feeling, not just recognize it. At the same time, this emphasis created tension. Critics worried that spectacle was overtaking story, that singers were becoming more important than characters, that technique threatened to overshadow meaning. These debates would never fully disappear, but they were signs of growth, not decay. Opera had discovered something fundamental. The human voice, when disciplined and unleashed, could carry emotion more directly than any instrument. It bypassed intellect and went straight to the body. By pushing voices beyond ordinary limits, opera expanded emotional range of art itself. It asked not just what stories could be told, but how much feeling a human being could be made to contain and release through breath alone. As opera matured, its freedom began to demand structure. The early years had been experimental, even chaotic, but widespread popularity created new pressures. Audiences wanted clarity, singers wanted showcases, composers needed balance. Out of this tension emerged a more defined dramatic architecture. Opera began to separate its emotional functions. Recitative carried the plot forward quickly and efficiently. Arias paused time. In these moments, action stopped so feeling could deepen. A decision already made was examined from every emotional angle. Desire lingered, regret expanded, triumph unfolded slowly. This rhythm, movement followed by reflection, became opera's heartbeat. This structure shaped how stories were written. Librettists learned to design scenes around emotional peaks. Conflict had to justify an aria. Characters were built not only through action, but through how they sounded when isolated in emotion. Identity became musical. Different cities favored different balances. In places like Naples, opera leaned toward vocal brilliance and formal beauty. Drama served the music. In other centers, emotional realism carried more weight. These regional styles competed, borrowing from one another, refining the form through rivalry. Opera also developed clearer character types. Heroes, lovers, villains, and rulers gained recognizable musical languages. Certain rhythms suggested authority. Certain melodic shapes implied vulnerability. Audiences learned to read these signals instinctively. Music became narrative shorthand. Crucially, this growing order did not eliminate intensity, it focused it. By containing emotion within formal boundaries, opera made it more powerful. A single aria placed at the right moment could resonate longer than constant musical motion ever could.
This balance between control and excess mirrored broader cultural changes. Europe was organizing itself politically, socially, aesthetically. Opera reflected this shift. Passion was still celebrated, but it had to be framed, shaped, and delivered with precision. Some critics mourned the loss of early rawness. Others welcomed the refinement. What mattered was that opera now had a language flexible enough to survive change. It could absorb new tastes without losing its core. By learning how to pace emotion, opera secured its future. It was no longer dependent on novelty or shock. It could build tension, release it, and leave audiences changed. The art form had found its shape. Now it only needed time to carry it forward. By the early 18th century, opera had outgrown the conditions that created it. What began as a specifically Italian solution to a Renaissance problem, how to fuse music and drama, had become something far larger. Opera was no longer an experiment, it was an export. Italian opera traveled with astonishing speed. Composers, singers, and impresarios moved from city to city, carrying scores, techniques, and expectations with them. Italian became the dominant language of opera, even in places where no one spoke it fluently. Audiences learned to feel emotion through sound before they understood the words. This spread changed opera's function. In Italy, opera had been a living conversation between philosophy, music, and society. Abroad, it became a symbol of refinement, power, and cultural prestige. Courts across Europe built opera houses not just for entertainment, but to signal sophistication. Hosting opera meant belonging to a larger cultural world.
As opera crossed borders, it adapted. Local tastes reshaped it. Some regions favored spectacle and grandeur. Others demanded clearer storytelling or moral restraint. Yet Italian foundations remained visible everywhere. The emphasis on voice, the alternation of recitative and aria, the belief that music could embody emotion more truthfully than speech. This expansion also intensified debate. Was opera meant to impress or to move? Should singers dominate or should drama lead? These arguments followed opera wherever it went, but conflict did not weaken the form, it sharpened it. Each challenge forced composers to refine their approach. Italian opera's success revealed something important about human psychology.
People did not need to understand every word to feel invested. The voice itself carried meaning. Tone, tension, breath, and silence communicated emotion directly. Opera proved that feeling could travel faster than language. At the same time, opera's spread marked a turning point in how art circulated. It was no longer bound to a single place or elite group. It moved through networks of theaters, patrons, and audiences. Opera became one of the first truly international art forms. Yet, even as it transformed abroad, opera never fully severed itself from its Italian origins. The belief that music should serve drama, that voices should embody emotion, remained its core logic. No matter how ornate or restrained it became, opera carried this founding principle within it. What began in small Florentine rooms now echoed across continents. Opera had escaped its birthplace, but it never escaped the idea that gave it life, that human stories deserved voices large enough to contain them. The birth of opera in Italy was not the creation of a genre so much as the creation of a new way of thinking about art. Before opera, music and drama existed beside each other. After opera, they became inseparable. Sound was no longer decoration, it became language. Opera proved that music could do more than accompany emotion. It could be emotion. A trembling phrase could replace a paragraph of dialogue. A held note could express indecision, desire, or despair more clearly than speech ever could. In doing so, opera changed how audiences understood truth on stage. Authenticity was no longer about realism, it was about emotional accuracy. This shift reshaped performers as well. Singers were not merely interpreters of notes, they became vessels of feeling, expected to merge technique with psychology. A convincing performance required more than a powerful voice. It required understanding why a character sang the way they did. Opera demanded that emotion be disciplined, not improvised. It also reshaped audiences. Listening became active. To follow an opera, you learned to read musical cues, to anticipate emotional turns, to sit inside extended moments of feeling. Opera trained patience. It asked listeners to stay with emotion longer than everyday life allowed. Most importantly, opera introduced a lasting idea that art could heighten reality without escaping it. The stories were often mythical, exaggerated, or implausible, but the emotions were recognizably human. Love hurt the same way. Loss sounded the same way. Fear tightened the breath the same way. Opera exaggerated form to reach truth.
This is why opera endured long after the Renaissance questions that created it faded. Even when styles changed, languages shifted, and theaters evolved, the core impulse remained. Humans still wanted stories that felt larger than life, but truer than words alone. The birth of opera did not replace earlier art forms. It absorbed them: poetry, theater, music, architecture, and fused them into a single experience. That fusion became its strength. In the end, opera succeeded because it answered a deep human need to hear inner life made audible. When music learned to speak, it did not just create a new genre, it gave emotion a voice powerful enough to fill a room, a city, and eventually the world. and that voice is still singing.